You ever just get mad at yourself because you realize too late that you forgot to turn the camera on and you've been yakking at nothing for like 30 minutes? So, I used to run a podcast, and the script for this video is just me recycling one of my old podcast scripts. I've edited this a little, and we're working with a whole new recording, because let's be honest, I was not the best podcaster. I mean, I was great at getting content out when I said I would, but I wasn't really good at editing or speaking into the mic at appropriate levels. Things that I'm honestly probably still not very good at, but running a YouTube channel is free. Podcasting is not. And, given the state of the world, my friends might appreciate seeing my face and listening to me talk about weird things for 20 minutes. Quit falling over. So, let's talk about Spider-Man, the history of cloning, and how science fiction can be a reflection of what scares us the most about the world we live in. Spider-Man as a character was first introduced in 1962. As a part of his origin story, Peter Parker was bitten by a radioactive spider. This spider was part of experiments to test the effects of radiation. At the time, radiation was kind of new and scary, at least to the public. Scientists had been studying radiation for years, but it wasn't really a thing the public concerned itself with until 1945, when the U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Now the general population is aware of radiation in a way it wasn't before. People are afraid of what radiation can do to living things, and that's a fear that begins to get reflected in the popular fiction of the time. So, Peter Parker gets bitten by a radioactive spider, setting off his decades-long adventures as Spider-Man. The thing is, Spider-Man isn't scary. Despite all of J. Jonah Jameson's attempts to convince us otherwise, there are plenty of films about creatures, or even people, that are hit with radiation and mutate into hideous monsters that terrorize the nearby populace. My favorite is a movie called Them, which is about giant irradiated ants that go around terrorizing the American Southwest. Leonard Nimoy is even in it, which is super cool. I mean, he's only in it for about a minute, but it was great to see him anyway. Radioactive bugs are pretty common and terrifying as a trope, especially if you're like me and you're terrified of spiders. It makes sense that if we're talking about fiction reflecting what scares us, that Spider-Man would talk about radioactive bugs or arachnids in this case. The thing is, Spider-Man's story is different than your typical radiation story. Peter Parker was given powers by one of the most terrifying forces on the planet, and used them for good. He became a hero. We went from stories like Them, where radioactive bugs are the monsters, to Spider-Man, a story where instead of wreaking havoc, the radioactive creature creates a superhero. Eventually, though, we learned a lot more about radiation, and it became a lot less scary. I mean, don't get me wrong, radiation is still terrifying, but we understand it now in a way that we didn't before. There are, however, other things that science does these days that scare the living crap out of us. A lot more than fiddling around with radioactivity ever could. Okay, jump! Jump it! We now have Doug. We have a Doug. Back in 2002, when they started making Spider-Man movies, they changed it so that the spider that bites Peter Parker was no longer radioactive. Instead, it was genetically engineered. This is because now the thing that scares us about science is playing with genetics. So while the Spider-Man movies touch on this for sure, experimental genetic research has already made its way into comic book storylines. Enter Ben Reilly, the Scarlet Spider. In October of 1975, the Spider-Man comics introduced Ben Reilly, a clone of Peter Parker. Outside of that issue, though, he didn't really matter until the 90s. From 1994 to 1996, he was a big player in the Clone Saga. This is a storyline that revolved around Peter Parker and his clones. Ben Reilly is, I'd say, the alpha clone. There is another clone named Kane, but we're not here to talk about him today. I believe Ben was the first and definitely most stable attempt at cloning Peter Parker, and he ends up getting his own costume, becoming the Scarlet Spider. Listen, I'm sure how I've described both Peter Parker and Ben Reilly is going to upset some really diehard Spider-Man fans, but you're going to have to cut me some slack. I didn't get into comic books until I was in college, so I'm super behind, and I'm going to have to trust the internet for some of my facts. Besides, I'm not here to give you a detailed history about either of those characters. I'm here to talk about how science fiction can reflect our real-life struggles and fears, even in something as decade-spanning as a major comic book franchise. In the 90s, when Ben Reilly became a major player in comic books, cloning was the hot-button issue. In 1993, the movie Jurassic Park premiered. This is a film in which scientists use transgenetic cloning technology to recreate dinosaurs. Then the Clone Saga happened in the Spider-Man comics, a storyline that ends in 1996, the same year that Dolly the sheep makes international headlines. She was the first mammal to be successfully cloned from an adult cell. Before that, scientists had only been able to make clones using embryonic cells. Dolly the sheep was created using genetic material from the mammary of an adult sheep, which was truly groundbreaking. Subsequently, Dolly created massive public interest and discussion into and about cloning that raged throughout my childhood. She brought cloning to the forefront of everyone's minds, but she wasn't really the beginning. Genetic research in cloning actually goes much further back. In my research, I've come across some conflicting dates as far as when the first clone was made, but the research that would lead to cloning started as early as the 1800s. Cloning is defined as making an exact genetic copy of an organism. The research being done in the 1800s wasn't about making genetic copies. The point was to gain an understanding into how cells differentiate from one another. The earliest experiments were done with sea urchins by a man named Hans Adolf Eduard Thresch. Sea urchins are invertebrates, which makes them very simple creatures. Their simplicity made them great starting points for genetic research. What Thresch did was take an embryo from a sea urchin and split it in half. The idea was that the split embryo would develop into two grotesque mutant half-urchins, and instead, both embryo halves developed normally and became two perfect sea urchins, thus creating what is arguably the first clone in the late 1800s. This process became known as artificial twinning, which makes sense when you think about it. If clones are just identical copies of other life forms, then identical twins are technically clones. These early sea urchin experiments are essentially just forcing a single embryo into becoming twins. I get why this isn't everyone's go-to moment for the first clone, though, especially since I am under the impression that these results were accidental, or at the very least unexpected. I get why this isn't everyone's go-to moment for the first clone, especially since I am under the impression that these results were accidental, or at the very least unexpected. Also, sea urchins aren't terribly complicated creatures, and the whole experiment replicated a naturally occurring phenomenon. So, while this was impactful to later research, I can understand why it's not going to show up at the start of everyone's history of cloning timelines. What happens next, though, is definitely considered cloning. It starts in the early 1900s with more artificial twinning by a guy named Hans Spiderman. Except instead of using sea urchins, he used salamanders. Then in the 1930s, Spiderman started experimenting with nuclear transfers between cells. He was still using salamanders and other amphibians, though. While they're more complex than sea urchins, they aren't as complicated as mammals. From this point forward, cloning becomes an area of research and science. The Chinese even started experimenting with cloning fish for agricultural and commercial purposes in the 1960s, which I think had to be super exciting for scientists. but I'm a historian, so what do I know? Cloning mammals remained out of reach until the 1980s. They started with mice, and these creatures became valuable in pharmaceutical research. It's apparently easier to test medications and their effects if all of your test subjects are genetically identical. At this point in time, though, human cloning is still a work of pure science fiction. Failure rates are obscenely high when cloning mammals. For example, Dolly was the only success in over 400 attempts. Although the success of Dolly in '96 did bring to light the potential of human cloning in a way that previous experiments just hadn't. Dolly was a sheep, a large and complex animal. She was also made using a differentiated cell, not an embryonic cell, from an adult animal. Although the success of Dolly in 1996 did bring to light the potential of human cloning in a way that previous experiments hadn't. Dolly was a sheep, a large, complex animal. She was also made using a differentiated cell from an adult animal, not an embryonic cell. Suddenly all you needed to make a clone of someone you knew was a skin sample. This began raising all sorts of ethical questions that would lead to actual bans on human cloning, even though making an exact copy of another human being was still a distant concept. Although, in 2002, a religious group did claim to have the first human clone. The group was called Reillism, and they're a UFO religion, meaning that they believe life was created by extraterrestrials. They started a company called Clonaid, which claimed to have created the world's first human clone, a girl named Eve. They've never produced proof, though, and are often viewed as a hoax. They do, however, still have a website you can visit. All of this talk about cloning makes for great speculative fiction, which is where characters like Ben Reilly come in. Sure, he peaked before news of Dolly hit the headlines, but obviously science was speeding towards her. None of this ends with Dolly, though. Modern cloning science is starting to get into some serious sci-fi territory. There are scientists who are actually trying to go full Jurassic Park and resurrect the woolly mammoth. In the Yakut region of Siberia, it is possible to find the frozen carcasses of mammoths with enough preserved tissue to get DNA from. Some researchers even claim to have found a mammoth that was frozen so quickly that when they thawed it, they found it still had liquid blood. With all of these samples and advancement in our abilities to analyze DNA, scientists have actually been able to sequence mammoth DNA. It turns out that mammoths share most of their DNA with modern Indian elephants. The plan is to create a transgenic embryo of a mammoth and have an Indian elephant carry it to term. Some researchers have even claimed that they are about 2 years away from successfully pulling this off and resurrecting an extinct species. You might be wondering what they want to do with this. I mean, what's the point? Are they going to try and start a Pleistocene-era themed amusement park? No. As cool as that might be, that is not the plan. Which is probably for the best. Apparently, scientists are doing this to help save the environment. Which sounds a little crazy, I know. But bear with me. According to an article I found on National Geographic's website, the tundra has more carbon contained in its frozen bowels than what we could produce by burning all of the trees on Earth 3 times over. So, as the global temperatures rise, the tundra melts, releasing huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. Research has proven that by reintroducing certain animals into the tundra, you can lower the temperature of the permafrost by as much as 15 degrees. This is because the presence of these animals encourages the growth of steppe grasses, which keep the area cool. The animal that would have the largest impact on this would, in fact, be the woolly mammoth. Just imagine, in a few years, we could be fighting global warming with cloned woolly mammoths. Not only that, but since Dolly, scientists have started cloning primates. The first successful attempts occurred in 1999. This was done using artificial twinning, which we talked about earlier with the sea urchins. But more recently, scientists in China successfully cloned a pair of macaques using the same methods that were used to create Dolly. Since these are the methods most likely to create successful human clones, it reinvigorates discussion about human cloning. The researchers involved in this project claim that they have no interest in human cloning, and what they're trying to do is get genetically identical test subjects for medical research. So the thought is that having a bunch of genetically identical test monkeys would benefit things like Alzheimer's research. There's also the potential for using cloning to create replacement organs for people in need of transplants. Regardless of how you feel about animal testing or using non-human primates for scientific research, the fact that scientists can now successfully clone primates is a huge deal. Not only does this reinvigorate talk about human cloning, it removes human cloning from the realm of science fiction. The successful cloning of a human could happen at any point now if scientists work towards that as a specific goal. Human cloning is still illegal in a lot of countries though, and scientists don't seem all that interested in taking it on regardless. What I mean is that no one seems interested in creating an exact copy of another human being. Human cloning is still illegal in a lot of countries though, and scientists don't seem all that interested in taking it on regardless. What I mean is that no one seems interested in creating an exact copy of another human. Making copies of organs is of interest, but making whole humans, not so much. That old sci-fi trope of cloning people to replace them for nefarious purposes doesn't seem like it'll end up being a real thing. But, I mean, who knows, maybe there's a secret supervillain out there somewhere. It seems timely, though, that with human cloning getting closer to becoming a reality and a hot topic of discussion, that Ben Reilly is back in comics. He was brought back and experimented on by the Jackal, the villain that created him in the first place, and he was tortured to the point of breaking and ended up taking over as the Jackal. He even began doing his own questionable experiments with cloning. In fact, he started his own cloning company, similar to what that religious group did. What he did with this company was start replacing people with clones. If you had a sick family member, he would promise to cure them, but really all he did was replace them with a clone. Ben Reilly was so messed up at this point that he thought what he was doing was right. He genuinely thought he was doing something good by bringing these people back. Of course, this is one of the things that makes people nervous about potential cloning. Human cloning. While I was researching, I came across a story about a photographer who spent $50,000 to have her daughter's dog cloned. Her daughter had killed herself, and all she had left to remember her by was her dog. The dog was getting old, and the woman felt that losing the dog would be like losing her daughter all over again. So she had the animal cloned. The reporter that interviewed her couldn't help but notice how much getting the dog cloned was like replacing her daughter, and they even asked her if she would have cloned her daughter if she could. The woman said she wasn't sure. Losing her child had put her in a terrible place to make decisions. I think this is what scares people the most about human cloning. In our grief over losing our loved ones, we might be willing to replace them. What does it mean about life if we can just replace people who have died with copies? Are these clones going to be just like the person they're modeled after? Or are they a different person? How long would they even live? Dolly the sheep lived half as long as a normal sheep. The sheep she was cloned from was 6 years old when its genetic samples were taken, which meant that it was halfway through the average lifespan for a sheep. Dolly only lived half as long as that sheep did, which is a fact true of most cloned animals. They have a lot of issues, such as unusual birth size, defects, and most notably, their shortened lifespans. It seems the older the source animal, the shorter the lifespan of the clone. So, cloning a loved one could mean you end up reliving their loss all too soon. On top of that, the clone you get might not be the same as the original. Sure, they'll be genetic copies, but is that what defines their personalities? While human cloning is suddenly within the realm of possibility, we don't understand all of the potential repercussions of cloning an actual human. It's sort of scary, and it's these fears that feed stories like Ben Reilly's. What the photographer I mentioned went through is what he catered to as the Jackal. So it shows us again how Spider-Man comics, like any good science fiction, can play with what scares us. They're a great way to explore what we find terrifying. I mean, sure, Ben Reilly, while he was the Jackal, was technically a supervillain, but he doesn't think he did anything wrong. He thought he was providing a valuable service and was doing a lot of good. Except he wasn't. Ultimately, I think this is a great way to explore generally terrifying concepts. It gives us this ambiguous view of the situation. Is it right or is it wrong? It makes us think about the thing in a way we might not have otherwise. I mean, I hadn't really thought about cloning or clones outside of the whole Dolly thing until I read Peter David's Ben Reilly solo run. I mean, I'm a historian, not a scientist. I'm not exposed to this sort of thing outside of the fiction I consume. So I think it's great that things like comic books can introduce us to this sort of thing. Sure, not everyone is going to be like me and do research into cloning because they read a comic, but the topic will be more relevant to people as they come across it in other places. If you read the Clone Saga, you might be more inclined to read an article about those clone monkeys if you stumble across one. I've got a whole back catalog of old podcast scripts that I would love to rework into videos, so if anyone's interested, that's on the docket. Next, it's probably going to be me raving about the historical inaccuracies of Dracula Untold, or, the bad Netflix Death Note movie that everybody hated when it came out. I finally watched it.